Today we're going to take a journey into our imagination. The third video in the Moss series continues this week in the studio. I want you to tap into all those feelings you have about landscapes you love. It will be our guiding source of inspiration for creating our moss landscapes. These creations have many names: moss pots, moss urns, and moss compotes. But I want to think beyond the vessel and use what we see in nature to create something that speaks to all our senses. It all starts with the moss. I let it guide me and inspire me as I made each creation. So if you are unsure how to tap into these feelings, have no fear. You just need to begin. The first landscape I'm creating is one of my favorite types of landscape. I love to paint rolling green hills. I love being able to be up high and see in the distance. It makes me feel like all things are possible and humbles me for how small I feel in the world. Let's begin. Start with a vessel that you love. As you will see, I use a variety of vessels, and each one lends a unique vibe. For the base, I filled the pot with regular potting soil. Next, I will use a styrofoam half circle to create a foundation. Then I use a pre-moistened potting seed mix starter soil for the base layer of the moss. Use a thin layer and pack it onto the form evenly. Now comes the fun part, adding the moss. I have a video on how to source the moss, which I highly recommend you watching. Moss doesn't have roots. It has something called risers. So what I like to do is take some scissors to the bottom of the moss and kind of even out the playing field on all my different pieces of moss. This makes it much easier to get a smoother application onto your form or your pot, and doesn't hurt the moss a bit. This pot I originally did with different moss, and after a few days I decided to redo it. So I want to remind you to have fun with this and know that you can do no wrong. It's all about creating something that brings the joy of nature inside and reminds you what connects you to Mother Earth. I'm so happy I redid this pot because it's my new absolute favorite one. This next landscape creation will show you that you don't need a huge pot. It can be very small and still have a big impact on your space. I created some flying birds from paper clay because there's something about seeing birds soar through the air that reminds me that we can all have the freedom to fly if we just spread our wings and flow with the wind instead of against it. next two landscapes were inspired by little wooden animals and vessels I found at the thrift store. I love thrift shopping because for me it's the thrill of the hunt. I keep in mind what I'm looking for, and if I'm patient, I usually find it. Sometimes it takes a couple of visits, but I'm always rewarded. So if you're unsure where to begin, maybe start with the thrift store and see what you can find that can inspire your landscape. In this urn that I found at the thrift store, I will be using only soil to create the mound. So if you don't have a styrofoam form, you can still create a similar result by just using dirt. The last landscape I wanted to include a plant and some rocks to add a whole new dimension to what is possible for your landscapes. These little landscapes will take some effort to keep alive. You will need to mist your moss daily, especially if you live in a dry climate or if the heat is on in your house. Moss likes to be moist. If this sounds like a nightmare, then know that you can leave your moss alone and it will dry out, and in most circumstances will stay green and vibrant. This is an example of some moss that I've had dry for about 6 months, and it still looks beautiful. Next week's video is the 4th video in the moss series. We're going to be creating an ancient Japanese art called kokidama, which translates to moss ball. The Japanese have long revered moss in their gardens inside and out. I have spent many hours studying this art, watching videos in languages I don't understand. But I have learned a bunch, and I'm excited to share all I know in next week's video. If you'd like to help support my channel, subscribe, give me a thumbs up, leave me a comment, and please recommend to anybody you think may enjoy my content. And I will see you next time.